Hello, and welcome to the Conversations in Time podcasts from the ORC. In this podcast, the guys will be talking about historical what-ifs, or counterfactual history for the aficionados in the audience.
Hello, and welcome to the first podcast from the Officially Retired Club, or ORC. I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
This is our first attempt. Let's see how entertaining we are versus how good we think we are. You never know.
We'll find out, won't we?
Yeah, well, we'll certainly find out. This first podcast is a what if. So, what's a what if then? Ian?
Sometimes known as alternative history, but it's basically, as we all know, there's points in history which seem set in time, but are they? I mean, lots and lots of things are on a knife edge or take months and years to actually come to fruition, but, you know, any twist and turn in any of those stories could result in a completely different result and consequences that go down through time. So it's a what if, it's a alternative history, it's a but why did that happen? Was that inevitable? It's chats about that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and ultimately, the consequences, you don't need to be an expert, I don't think. I mean, to have an opinion, you know, and we're not experts by any means or by any...
no, but we'll try and keep the total flights of fancy to the minimum. Try and keep it grounded in the possibility rather than the flights of fancy that you might fear here somewhere else. But yeah, ultimately, it's an opinion based on some knowledge of events. Not necessarily we've done a lot of investigation where we've not spent weeks and weeks investigating it, but we like to kind of try and keep it grounded in based on what actually could have happened.
Keeping it real.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Down with the anyway. Yeah.
Down with that sort of thing. But
yeah. Right. So, what's going to be episode 1? What if?
So, I thought what we'd discuss today would be the consequences or the alternative history we just talked about of what if the Manhattan Project had failed. You know, ultimately, what if the atomic bomb or the thermonuclear bomb, call it what you like, proved to be too difficult for whatever reason. We don't really need to wonder why. Maybe it was just there wasn't enough resources in the world to make it happen. Maybe the physics
maybe the science wasn't quite good in, you know, the theory is one thing, practice is another. Let's face it, you know, nuclear fusion, the theory is well known, but can't get it working. But, you know, we could be in you could think of it as a similar scenario, that they understood the theory, but just couldn't engineer the solution.
Yeah, so in 1945, the Trinity test failed in New Mexico. They went back to it over and over. Well, not ultimately infinitely, but they keep going back to it. They realised what was wrong, but they thought, well, we couldn't fix it, or we'll try and do this, and it still didn't work. Anyway, so let's essentially say it didn't work in 1945, and by the late 1950s, essentially, they'd given up, that being the Americans, and if the Americans couldn't get it to work, that meant the Russians.
We can come on to that, can't we? So let's talk about whether, because that's an interesting scenario in terms of would they have continued to try and get it working? And there's you could say yes and you could say no, but I mean, let's just talk about the initial consequence of what would have happened. I can't even remember the month. Was it May? Was it?
It was relatively late, so it was after the Germans surrendered. So it would be, I think it was June. So it was dropped in reality in August. So let's say it failed in June. For those of you out there who are saying, no, it wasn't, my apologies. I'm pretty certain, I'm not going to Google it, but I'm pretty certain it was June. It was later than you think.
Yeah, I was going to Google it before we started and I forgot.
Yeah, but anyway, whatever. Very professional. But yeah, so anyway, it failed. It you know, in the original history, the test to the dropping on Japan was quite quick.
That's right. I mean, it was, you know, at the end of the day, they obviously developed it as a bomb so that they could then build another one and drop it as soon as possible, didn't they? So,
yeah.
You know, right. So the first thing that would have happened, which would have been a massive change within the history of our current history or current timeline, if you want to call it like that, is that it wouldn't have been dropped on Japan. Now, the project, which I can't remember what it was called, and I know you will, Ian.
What?
Or not the project. What was the
Operation Olympic was the.
That's right. Yeah, the taking of the home islands.
Yes, indeed.
So ultimately, that would have to have been implemented.
Yes, and the interesting thing about that is that there's many interesting things about it, but the estimate of casualties was 1 million US casualties. That usually means, when they say casualties in the Second World War, they usually mean a third of the casualties are dead, 2/3 are wounded. With wounded, even wounded is open to interpretation. A large chunk of those wounded would be incapacitated for life. And obviously there was also parallel operations in Malaysia and Singapore, or Malaya as it was in Singapore. The British would have were going to attack Singapore from the sea. That would have been fairly difficult, shall we say?
So, just out of interest, were the British, were the Allied forces pushing the Japanese back in?
Yes, so obviously the last amphibious operation was Okinawa. So that, and Okinawa was, inverted commas, one of the Japanese home islands, although it's about 700 miles from Japan. So that was a precursor. That would have given them tactical fighter bomber range aircraft, as well as naval carrier-based aircraft support in terms of medium bombers could fly from there over Japan. Fighters couldn't. Maybe the P-38. I'd have to look at that, or the P-51 indeed. But that was a last jump-off point before the intended attack on Japan. So, I mean, the question is, would the American public accept those casualties? Because there's alternatives to alternatives. They didn't have to invade. They could have used what they were doing anyway. They could have starved the Japanese. They destroyed most of the Japanese merchant marine. The Germans, essentially, after all, in the First World War, surrendered because of the British naval blockade. People were starving. The Japanese would have been in a similar situation. So there's a frontal attack or an attack on the home islands causing 1 million casualties in America. Would the American public have put up with that?
Well, I don't think they would have, but I don't think that they would have thought of that to start with. I think that the original plan was to invade, and they probably would have, But I'm not sure that they would have taken a step back and said, "All right, well, shall we, shan't we?" Because don't forget, they didn't know that the bomb was going to work or not. So
no, indeed, most of the
was an invasion. They didn't have an alternative, did they?
No, most of the strategic commanders, i.e., Nimitz, who was the naval commander, and MacArthur, who was the ground force commander, which slightly would have come into a different part of Japan, but they were unaware of the atomic bomb until it was dropped. So the planning was
well in advance, probably.
Yes, exactly. But the issue is the Japanese had deliberately defended Okinawa in a way that caused maximum casualties. So they had this process of keeping close. There's basically two ways of defending territory. There's withdrawing into a hinterland like the Russians did to maintain your forces, and he who fights and runs away lives to fight another day, or there's just basically fighting to the death. So the Japanese were fighting to the death, and the disadvantage of that from the American point of view is that it makes it difficult to leverage your advantages. The advantages the American had was overwhelming firepower. You can't use overwhelming firepower on the front line if your own troops are continually in contact with the enemy, because you end up killing too many of your own troops with huge bombing raids and naval gunfire and the rest of it. So had they done that in Japan, that's why the estimate of casualties would have been so much. The Japanese would not have withdrawn. They had nowhere to withdraw to. They would not have withdrawn into the hinterland. They would have fought essentially feet by yard to mitigate the overwhelming firepower of the Americans. Think Hamas in Gaza, and essentially it's the same principle. So so I don't know. It's difficult to understand what the mechanism of the American public objecting to the casualty would be. Again, it's whether
it was. I mean, at the end of the day, it was growing in America, though, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, the
voice or the noise about the number of American casualties in the Pacific.
Yeah, yes, and Okinawa in particular was. We'd have to look it up, but the casualties were intense. And also, at Okinawa was a large number of naval vessels were sunk by kamikaze attack. And again, the Japanese had saved many planes in Japan for that very purpose.
No, that's right. So I don't think there was any question that they were just going to give up. I think that.
Oh no, 100%. I mean,
I mean, it's in because one of the things that the Americans had on Japan was that they could still bomb it even before the bomb was dropped. They had almost total air superiority.
Well, they did. I mean, that's the thing that people forget. More people were killed by conventional bombing of Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo, than was killed in the atomic attacks.
That's right. So, I mean, one of the things that they would have started with, I imagine, before they even invaded, because let's face it, invading the home islands is still something that, would have to have been set up. I mean, I know they were planning for it, but they were planning for it in 1946, weren't they? They weren't planning to invade Japan.
Indeed, because there was the intention of moving troops from Europe. The troops in Europe who had defeated Germany, they would have to be moved across. Not all of them, but a significant number of them. How happy they would have been to do that is another story as well. So you got the morale aspect of that. But you're right, it was a massive operation, or it was planned to be a massive operation. And
Japan's view was, let's cause as many casualties as possible, so that they say, instead of unconditional surrender, let's get round the negotiating table and negotiate a surrender.
But
wasn't that they knew they were going to lose? It wasn't as if they thought they'd win.
I suppose the difference with the atomic bomb going off as opposed to just a conventional attack and you're defeated is that it was the shock. Nobody knew what an atomic bomb was.
Well, that's right. I mean, blink of an eye, and 80,000 people are dead.
Exactly. The Japanese had no idea how many the Americans had. I mean, they had 2 that you could deploy. They are, again, for the rivet counters out there, you could Google it. But I think there was potentially up to 6 within another couple of months. But it wasn't. But 6 atomic bombs on a country like Japan would still be significant. But it was that shock. That fed into the politics of Japan. So there was always an area of or part of Japanese politics, or certainly the competition between the army and the navy that could see that this was all a disaster. It was always going to end in defeat. So having a shock like the atomic bomb gave a convenient excuse to go to the emperor and say we should give up. But whether that would have been possible with an invasion and the insult to the country of foreign soldiers tramping around Japan and all the rest of it, whether that shock factor would have resulted in a surrender, or whether it would have been similar to Germany, where essentially every town and every city would have to be conquered.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, you could say that Nagasaki and Hiroshima could have been firebombed in the same way as Tokyo, and arguably resulted in the same number of deaths. I mean, the Tokyo bombings were horrific because it was a firestorm, but ultimately all of the Japanese buildings were wood, weren't they? So I mean, it was a similar scenario would have happened almost everywhere else.
But when you think about it, there'd been, the RAF had destroyed Hamburg in a firestorm in the middle of the war, and the Germans didn't surrender.
But that was only but if you're doing that city after city, well, because that's to me that's the first thing that they would have done. They would have started bombing Japan and bombing the cities. I mean, they were already bombing the cities, and they bombed the cities. They bombed other cities after Hiroshima was dropped.
Yes, I mean the interesting thing is that there was actually there was bombing raids after the atomic bombs were dropped. I mean, the last bombs dropped in Japan were, again, the river counters keep me straight here, but the last bomb dropped in Japan was actually from a Royal Navy aircraft carrier group. It was just a question of timing. It just happened to be they were the last people bombing a Japanese shipyard when they surrendered. So there was round the clock bombing at tactical level from carriers and strategic from B-29s. But again, I think it's difficult to underestimate the shock of the atomic bomb. So again, it was a shock, and B, it was so unique that it gave.
That's right. Yeah, but we are talking about what if it didn't. If they didn't drop it.
Well, that's the point, though. If it didn't, you wouldn't have that shock factor. It would be more of the same.
That's right. Yeah.
More of the same. Going back to my analogy with Germany, Hamburg was destroyed by a firestorm. So was Dresden. The Germans didn't surrender because they'd become used to it. Without the atomic bomb shock I suspect the war would have, well, it's stating the blindly obvious perhaps, the war would have gone on. You have this issue with the American public opinion, how that leverages into their strategic thinking. Debate is, you have a new.
But then you could say,
president.
well, what about? So I think that ultimately in the US we know roughly what would happen, because there was a growing call for some sort of.
Well, I think the Americans were just fed up.
But
their economy was booming. They wanted to get on. They were fed up with the war. Never mind people dying. It was, there was a whole thing.
But then if you then take it back to the UK, and it's not called the Forgotten Army or whatever it was. What do you think would have happened here? It was a different front with the Japanese. We were fighting a different type of war.
The scale was different. So the 14th Army in Burma was only a quarter British. So it does beg the question, what the Indian troops would have made of it. Been promised with a small p independence. The British troops, they'd seen their German war finish, and that was the only existential war that affected Britain. Japan was never going to take over Britain, so they got the morale. But then attacking Singapore from the sea with amphibious attack, that would have been a costly exercise in casualties. I wouldn't mutiny and stuff. I think it's unlikely. Just bad morale affecting the performance of the troops is distinctly possible. Probable, in fact. So it would have been very, very difficult. I think ultimately Japan would have been militarily defeated. What we haven't discussed, obviously, is the Russians. Obviously, when the atomic bomb was dropped, the Russians, what a coincidence, decided to attack or declare war on Japan. Would they have done that anyway?
It's probably not. Who knows? You never know.
It's hard to say. Having beaten the Russians, they would have, as they did, have their eye on some islands that they've taken over, maybe even a part of Japan in the same way they've taken over Germany. Although they didn't have amphibious forces to speak of or anything significant. Certainly they would be interested in parts of Manchuria, just for the sake of it. So you certainly assume that they would have rolled into Manchuria, over the Russian Chinese border. It's difficult to see. It wouldn't have ended. It would have ended militarily. I don't think the Americans would have given
1946, 1947, couldn't it?
Truman probably wouldn't have won the next election because he only won it by a whisker. Had he been sat on 1 million American casualties, a third of whom are dead, I doubt he'd have won the next election. So let's not go down that rabbit hole. I can't even remember who he was up against. Somebody Dewey, I think, but whatever his
there's another potential what if. There's another potential what if. Although we won't talk about it, but it's.
Let's not go off into too many tangents. We've been.
But if say there was a lot of bombing of Japan, what if the emperor had been killed on a bombing raid?
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, it is.
Because the emperor stopped he stepped in, and instructed the surrender. Which obviously he could have done at any point. But if he wasn't there, and it's just interesting. I wonder what they would have done. What would the military have done?
Well, he obviously had an heir.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Pretty certain his heir was born.
Hirohito, wasn't it? Yeah.
No, that was his name. Whether I can't remember. He died in the 1980s. I can visualize his son again. The rivet counters are googling it, but I think he was born. But the bottom line is, he would have been a total figurehead, but arguably the emperor was a total figurehead anyway. Because the argument is that one of the arguments is if Hirohito, the emperor, could have stopped and did stop the war after the atomic bombs were dropped, why didn't he stop it before? I thought he was just a figurehead.
So that's right. So that's a different conversation as to whether he actually stopped.
But coming back to our point, I think is, there's many things the Americans would have invaded. The Americans would have taken the casualties. The British would have taken the casualties. The British Indian Army probably would have carried on, but maybe not, and therefore the British would have had to scale back their attacks and perhaps look to the Australians to help them. They would have helped. It would have been absolutely dreadful. a million plus casualties.
Pretty catastrophic.
Yeah, and we haven't talked about the casualties in Japan. These million plus casualties, these are American casualties.
Oh yeah, that's you
could
be 10
multiply
times.
that by 5 or 10 for Japanese civilians. Japan would have been destroyed. Whether it would have come back as it did, I mean, Germany did, but then that it was
I don't think it would. I don't think it would have, because it was, the Japanese were fighting to the death and the Germans weren't.
No, and also there was the Americans had had the Japanese inflicted 1 million casualties on the Americans, would the Americans have pumped money into the Japanese economy the way of the Germans? And let's be realistic, they did it for the Germans to counterbalance the Russians.
That's right.
Cold War, which would be even more important if there was no atomic weapons, because the mass hordes of Russian tanks would have needed some counterbalance, and the German economy, even more counterbalance. The German economy, blah blah blah, and the German army being resurrected in the 50s. Would they have done that in Japan? There was no direct strategic requirement to do that. The Japanese, to a certain extent, weren't destroyed. Their economy was still building. In a modern sense, as much as it was very much a trades economy. You can build a plane by getting 600 people to build 600 parts in their back gardens. That all changed in the 50s. But they still needed investment. Would they have got that investment in America? I doubt it. I mean, America had been very bitter about that. Why didn't you just surrender?
That's what I mean. I think that they would have had a much sourer taste in the mouth, and I think that it would have created more problems with the Japanese as well, in terms of Japan being occupied and all this type of stuff, in a way that it wasn't.
Yeah, so I think in terms of its impact on the Second World War, it would have been horrendous had the atomic bomb not worked.
That's
massive invasions, massive casualties, massive destruction, a different political scene afterwards, obviously in Japan and in America, because I don't think Truman would have got re-elected. People would necessarily blame him, but it's a question of it's time for change. Well, we don't want this to happen again, do we? And there wouldn't have been that sensation of, our technology saved us and ended the war in a flash.
So let's move the clock forward then. When you look at what happened after the Second World War, regardless of whether even with the bomb, there were two fairly serious wars that involved the large powers, the Americans and the Russians and the Chinese, which was the Korean War and then the Vietnam War. And at the end of the day, even with the bomb wasn't used. So it's fair to say that the bomb wouldn't have made much of a difference to those two conflicts. The fact that there wasn't a bomb.
Well, it's debatable, isn't it?
I think that they would have happened anyway, because weren't they almost a result of the removal of the empires that sort of controlled those parts of the world, and then got taken over the Japanese, and then there was a vacuum after they left,
Yeah, no, agreed. But if you look at the Korean War, first of all, I mean, the partition of Korea probably wouldn't have happened in the first place, because the Russians, the war would have gone on for longer. Therefore, the Russians would have taken the whole of the Korean peninsula. So you could argue that the war wouldn't have happened there in the first place. But let's
fair enough.
Let's presume point, Let's presume that it did, and it was still partitioned. I mean, MacArthur wanted to use the atomic bomb. He was told he couldn't and was sacked. Now he wouldn't have had that option, but the Russians had very few atomic bombs in 1950. They had no means of delivering it to continental America. So America had free range. That's not quite the right word, but it had a free hand in gathering international opinion and sending out armies to Korea, blah 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 blah, knowing that Russia could do nothing about it. Right, all right, Russia could have invaded Germany, but again, the Americans had atomic bombs, and they could have blitzed their tank armies. So you could argue again that the balance of the atomic weapon balance was very much skewed. Again, making this figure up for illustrative purposes, 10 to 1 in American favour. So that kept the Russians, so the Russians did supply jets, and the Russians supplied via China, and they supplied pilots, although they pretended to be advisors, and they pretended not to be flying combat missions, although they did. So that didn't ultimately make any difference to the outcome of the war. But had they not had the American nuclear arsenal at their throat to a certain extent, they might have sent thousands, tens of thousands of their own soldiers. Who knows?
Yeah. But then, like you say, it might not have resulted in in a conflict in Korea, because they would have just marched all the way through. And
well, exactly, there wouldn't have been any South Korea as such to because the war went on for longer and the Russians were involved. But it's an obvious place for them to go. They had previously, before the communists, had part of Korea as part of the Russian Empire, so it makes logical sense that they would just roll down the peninsula.
But then, let's we can make the assumption, what if? So we'd assume that the Korean War probably wouldn't have happened. More likely than not. But the Vietnam War is different.
Yes, because that was essentially a throwback to the colonial era, wasn't it? So the French, again, the French would have still tried to keep it. The fact there's no atomic bombs, there was no impact on the French's ability to try and keep it. They then gave up in the 50s, and then it split in two. So yes, the Americans would have still gone in. The atomic aspect would have no aspect changed to that. I can't see how
because it was anti-communist, wasn't it? So.
Yeah, and there's this so-called domino theory, which is pretty much discredited. That you lose Vietnam, you lose Laos, you lose Thailand, you lose Malaysia, blah blah blah, you lose India, etc., etc. Well, okay, I don't think anybody really subscribes to that anymore. But so it's interesting. It's hard to imagine any impact to the Vietnam War. I mean, the Americans.
Yeah, it's funny because you would have had large casualties from Japan, and then arguably more casualties in Vietnam. There's still a lot of American casualties in Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean that's yeah. I mean the interesting thing is, I think there's a quote from General Eisenhower who says, "Don't ever get involved in a war on the Asian mainland." Well, they didn't take any notice of Eisenhower when he said that the first time round, inverted commas. And using our alternative history, would he have taken any notice of that sentiment the second time around? So they still think that their overwhelming firepower can defeat insurgent type wars. I think we've seen recent history saying that it's about the politics, not about the military. It's interesting. You look at the Vietnam War and you think, well, the fact that there's no atomic weapons probably, and even the history having changed up to it, I think it would have pretty much
followed a similar path.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so after the Vietnam War, then, so when we come, for me, I mean, there are other things which would likely happen. So, and I can't remember which ones comes first. I think it's the Berlin airlift. With the building of the wall. And all this type of stuff, or the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think that comes second, doesn't it? The Cuban Missile Crisis, and that's 1962.
Yeah, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, by definition, it certainly
wouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Well, exactly.
It's weird because it's one of those things that one of the reasons for the development of long range, ICBMs, was for the delivery of nuclear weapons.
100%. Yeah.
Would they have developed rockets if they hadn't have had nuclear weapons? I mean, is it worth putting that much effort into delivering a 10-ton normal bomb?
Not.
I mean, the Germans did with V2s, or tried to.
Yeah, but those were what they would call nowadays intermediate range ballistic missiles, aren't they? They weren't. But then I suppose the alternative to nuclear weapons is nerve agents and chemical weapons and stuff. But they still don't. I don't think you can spray a great deal of chemical weapons from a missile over a city. So again, it's interesting that that might have been a massive positive. So in the sense that a lot of the development of rockets would have been purely as it was done in parallel for space and stuff. There is obviously nowadays we have precision weapons that can be fired from hundreds of miles away, so that the aircraft dropping them isn't shot down. But in the 60s, there's no great benefit of dropping a small weapon from Russia. You could equally do the same from a ship 100 miles out at sea, if you want to hit a particular building or a particular city with just as a terrorist type attack. So, but I think the Cuban Missile Crisis wouldn't have happened. But what might have happened is something much worse, arguably. It would have been an attack on Western Europe by Russia, because they had nothing stopping them.
No, you're right. I think that's the other thing, that when you come back to it, there would have been another war in Europe, or some form of conflict with Russia.
Well, exactly, because the rivet counters, the people who know this off the top of their head will know, but the number of Russian tanks versus NATO tanks was something like 10-1 or 5-1. And the argument is that the NATO doctrine was that they could hold back the Russians for up to 6 or 7 days until the ammunition ran out, and the Russians would have even more tanks. All right, the tanks they have and the soldiers had by then would be reservists and wouldn't be their frontline stuff, but they still have, NATO would be done, and then we'd have to resort to tactical nuclear weapons. Well, if you haven't got the tactical nuclear weapons, what do you do? But the obvious answer is, in the 1950s, they would have realised this. So I suppose the argument is that NATO stroke America stroke Britain stroke France, the sort of the major players, even Germany, would have had literally huge armies, beggaring the economy. You know, I don't know what percentage of GDP was spent.
Well, it's you know, when you if you look back, I know we're going back to the Japan, the Japanese thing, but you know, if there's a lot of effort going into subduing Japan, even if you say it went into 1948, Europe's been arguably at peace for a couple of years. And Stalin's getting impatient, and isn't that his perfect time to?
Well, that's true, and arguably what was holding him back was American atomic weapons, or the threat of them. So we wouldn't have got to. He might have ran his tanks to the English Channel in the late 40s.
You could almost see that mainland Europe could have been part of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
it doesn't take much to think, well, that's a potential consequence.
Yeah. And had he not done it then, he could have chosen to do it any time in the next 20 years. If NATO hadn't increased, defence spending by values that would be equivalent to the Second World War, wherever those values are. But you can imagine, conscription would have been not just 2 years of 18-year-olds; it would have been perhaps 5 years for up to your mid-20s. But had he done it in the late 40s, it would have been a moot point, because, whether he would have gone as far as attacking the UK, probably not, but he wouldn't have to, because if he's sitting off the coast of Dover, much like the Germans, he would not, that would probably be good enough. He would be basically saying, well, what are you going to do now? You're not going to do anything about it, are you? So let's just get on.
That's it. What can you do? Yeah, you're already overstretched in the Far East, all this sort of stuff.
Yes, your economy's been wrecked by German bombing and just being knackered from war production. Yes, the Americans can give you lots of stuff, and yes, they probably will. But the Americans are not going to reinvade France again to get rid of the Russians, having just done the Germans 4 years ago, and as you say, having lost 1 million.
That's right. Yeah,
in Japan.
It would have been, they'd have just washed their hands, or certainly would have taken a step back.
Or certainly base some planes here, but the planes would have been there to stop them jumping across the channel. They wouldn't have been there to.
Britain would have been quite a camp. It would have been very fortified.
Yes, and the impact to society would have been huge, because there would be obviously in Europe there would be no EU. There would have been vassals of Russia. They would have puppet governments, much like the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland and all the rest of it became Hungary and Romania and East Germany. There would have been similar in France, Belgium, Netherlands. How far probably the Scandinavian countries would have been left alone, but told what to do, and and done what they were told. The economy of the UK would have been very much reduced. It was struggling as it was in the 40s, but in late 40s. But everybody listening to this pod, depending when you were born, your life would have been very different, because the economy would have been very much a war economy. Well, not a war economy, but certainly putting money into defence. The economy, trading, would have been very little trading with Europe. There wasn't a huge amount of trading with the Eastern Bloc in the 70s and 60s and 80s.
Yeah, and if it extended further into Europe, it would be the US mainly, and potentially the Commonwealth.
Well, indeed, but if you you've got to look at a map. we're in danger of going into Brexit territory. But you've only got to look at a map and say, well, if you can't trade with your immediate neighbours 20 miles away, trading with people thousands of miles away is a poor alternative. That is quite an analogy with Brexit, isn't it? But well, let me think of that. But anyway, that's another story. But so Britain would have been, its economy would have taken a massive dink. Would that have caused social problems? you know, it probably would have done.
There were already communists in the UK. You know, it's a free country. Who knows? There might have been.
Indeed.
Enough social unrest to say that they want to join.
I did hear somebody say the other day that had they not stopped national service in 1959, all the Beatles would have joined the army, and had any thoughts of being a pop group bashed out of them, and there wouldn't have been any Beatles. So if you imagine the 1950s in Britain consisted of 5 years national service until you're in your mid-20s, and there are very few exceptions. You know, would the pop culture of the 60s have developed? Not in the UK, it wouldn't have done. With communist Russia 20 miles away, and the economy a fraction of what it would have been otherwise, and you know, it's a completely different country. That's assuming that the Russians, having rolled the tanks across France because nothing was there to stop them, an atomic bomb. Chose to stop.
Stalin, he wasn't a philanthropist, was he, Stalin?
Indeed.
No. He only stopped at where he stopped after the Second World War because he met the Allies.
Well, exactly, and you know, there's an argument. You know, the Dresden bombing was it's debatable, but it was a threat to him saying, look what we can do with our 1,000 bombers. But then when you add your 1,000 bombers to half a dozen atomic bombs, it's like, well, you can have 3,000 tanks in a river valley, but we can blow that river valley up, and you've got 3,000 lumps of metal. You know, so you know, it's without the atomic bomb, the war in Japan goes on and on. Stalin has nothing to keep him in check, other than his good nature. We all know about that. The impacts to the American economy and the American way of life, and the massive impact to the British way of life had he chosen to roll these tanks to France, incalculable. You know, at social level as well. It's hard.
The consequence, like we said. So you know, the consequences of this. You know, so we're looking at where we are today. The consequences would have been unimaginable, arguably. You know, they would have been so.
I'm trying to think of a country that you can use as an analogy, but it's almost, you know, that's been massively threatened by a neighbour, and you know, I suppose certainly in history there's been plenty of countries like that. Whether there's an enormous one, I suppose, without going too far over the top, you know, you could argue that, you know, Gaza was overwhelmed by its neighbour, unable to do things rightly or wrongly, and its economy was very much impoverished. So that's kind of what you're looking at, and that, if you look at that, bred extremism and terrorism. So again, you know, and with the 4 parts of the United Kingdom, would they have all split up, and you know, as much as the Balkans did in the 1990s, you know, into
lots of I mean, we could talk endlessly about stuff like that, you know. So. As we've been yakking for quite a while, this turned out a bit different to what I was expecting, to be honest.
Well, it depends. How did you think?
No, I think that, you know, it's quite an interesting topic, and we could have explored other bits longer, you know.
Yeah.
So,
well, there's always time for a part 2.
No, there is, and maybe we'll come back to it, you know. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that one of the things that we wanted to do with this podcast is always look at the for and against, or the good and the bad.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, for me, based on what we've now gone through, the fact that the bomb went off was a good thing. I think that
yes, I mean,
based on our view, it's difficult to deny it wasn't it was a savior of lives, you know, savior of.
But there's always the argument, you know, that, you know, where you're the guy whose shadow was etched into the pavement in Hiroshima, you'd probably think otherwise, wouldn't you? But
absolutely, that's
you know,
right. Yeah.
That's, you know, the good things are it stopped a war, and that can never be a bad thing.
And it's ultimately less people died even in that war. You know, a lot less.
Yes, but then the shadow, when we're of a certain generation, and the shadow of nuclear Armageddon hung quite. Yeah,
but I mean, ultimately, isn't that the bad thing?
Indeed, it is. So it seemed quite bad in the early 80s, obviously the early 60s, a bit before our time. But you know, it's and that you know, and obviously the money spent on to this day, money spent on nuclear weapons. You know, and even if you think, well, I'd rather spend that money in hospitals, but let's say if you spent it on conventional weapons, I think there's people in our services who would quite happily have modern vehicles rather than 1960s vehicles, but that money's been spent on atomic weapons, so that's a bad thing as well, arguably. To spend, even if you don't spend it on hospitals, you can spend it on some decent kit, so that So I think it's interesting. Is the good thing was the immediate end of the war. The bad thing was the Cold War, and even the last couple of years that Putin's is holding back support to Ukraine allegedly by saying, well, if you give them these sort of precision weapons, we might drop a tactical nuclear weapon on somewhere. Whether that anybody's taking any notes of that, but it gives you pause for thought when you read it. The
consequence of nobody using the bombs is that there will be an escalation if anybody ever uses one. It's almost like the longer you don't use them, the more you're going to use if one goes off.
Well, our alternatively is that they have if you've got huge countries like America and Russia and even China now, if they don't have the mutually assured destruction concept, they might be more inclined to attack each other. So
that's right, yeah, because they've got no experience. There's only Japan who actually understands what the real consequences of a nuclear bomb.
Well, the trouble is that the people who make the decisions are seldom the people who deal with the consequences in the nice little bunkers, and they might morally deal with the consequences, but they wouldn't be incinerated and starving to death. But no, it's interesting that we've come to the conclusion that it was a good thing that atomic weapons were available, but then a bad thing, because it's almost as you needed to uninvent them, which is obviously impossible once you've deployed.
That's right. Yeah, the genie's out the bottle. It's almost like it's one thing to say it was good at the beginning and now ban it, but it's too late. Even though you might have banned it, doesn't stop them coming back ever. Or somebody.
No, once the principle has been
secretly keeping them, and all this sort of stuff.
If you go back, well, there was talk of the United Nations holding on to them at some point. I think Oppenheimer talked about that, but if you look at the state of the United Nations at the moment, with Iran being in charge of the Human Rights Council and stuff, I think I don't think that would have been a particularly useful way of looking after nuclear weapons.
No, that's right.
So I think that's a wrap.
Yeah, I think that was as a first episode from the ORC podcast. I think that's I found that very interesting. I found it interesting, but then we're doing the talking, so hopefully people who are doing the listening found it interesting.
That brings me on to my last thought: is that you'll hear some details at the end of this podcast about how you can contribute to the conversation if you want. If you follow us on Twitter, which the details of which will be there at the end. Give us your thoughts, good, bad, or indifferent.
We're thick-skinned because we're old, so it's we don't mind. Good, yeah, like you say, yes. Good or bad.
We're also married and frequently told by other halves that we're talking nonsense as well.
That's right. So thanks everybody for listening. Look out for our next episode, and we shall see you
next time.
Next time. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.
That's it. Now, we want to hear what you think. So those of you who are part of the Twitterati or X-rated or whatever it is these days, you can leave your comments, good or bad, at ORC_time. We love your feedback. Remember, if you liked this podcast, tell your friends. And if you didn't, tell your friends.